Clara Whitmore dug her father's grave with her own two hands. No preacher, no neighbors, no one. Just a woman and a shovel, and the Montana summer pressing down on her like a fist. She didn't cry until the last shovel of dirt landed. Then she wiped her face, walked back to a broken-down farmhouse, and made a decision. She was staying. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel, follow Clara's journey all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning after she buried her father, Clara Whitmore woke up before sunrise and went straight to work. Not because she wasn't grieving. She was. The grief sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't cough out. But grief didn't fix broken fence posts. Grief didn't keep the horses from wandering. Grief didn't put food on the table, or water in the trough, or stop the rot creeping along the west wall of the barn. So she worked. She found a loose post near the south pasture and hammered it back into the ground with a rock because she couldn't find the mallet. Her hands blistered. She kept hammering. The post held. She moved on to the next one. By noon, she had fixed 3 posts, refilled the water trough by bucket from the stream 40 yards away, and eaten half a biscuit left over from 2 days ago. She stood in the middle of the yard, sweat soaking through the back of her dress, and looked at what her father had left her. It wasn't much. 14 acres on the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Range. A farmhouse with a sagging porch and a door that didn't close all the way. A barn with a patched roof. 4 horses, 2 of which were too old to work. A vegetable patch that hadn't been watered in a week because her father had been too sick to manage it, and she'd been too focused on him to notice. And now there was just her. Clara was 27 years old. She had taught school in Billings for 3 years before her father's letters started coming in shorter and shorter until finally one arrived that was only 4 words. I need you home. She came home. She hadn't left since. That was 8 months ago. Through the autumn, through the winter, through a spring that was colder and harder than anyone remembered. She had kept the farm alive, and her father alive, and herself alive, and that felt like enough of an accomplishment that she didn't let herself think too far past it. Now it was summer. Her father was gone. And Clara Whitmore was standing in the middle of a yard that needed more work than one person could reasonably do, trying to figure out where to start. She started with the vegetable patch. 3 days later, she rode into Harlan to buy seed. Harlan was the nearest town 2 hours by wagon, which meant she could make the trip and be back before dark if she left early enough. It wasn't a large town. 1 main street, a handful of storefronts, a livery, a saloon, a church that needed painting. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody's name and everybody's business, and neither of those things were necessarily a comfort. Clara tied her wagon in front of the general store and went inside. Miles Peabody ran the store. He was a thin man in his 50s, with a careful way of moving that always made Clara think of a bird deciding whether or not to land. He looked up from behind the counter when she came in, and something shifted in his expression. Not unkindness exactly, more like discomfort, like she was a problem he hadn't figured out yet. Miss Whitmore, he said. Mr. Peabody. She pulled her list from her pocket. I need seed, winter wheat and turnip, and if you have it, some garden twine. I have it. He didn't move right away. How are you getting on out there? Fine, she said. Your father's been gone, what, a week now? 9 days. He nodded slowly. That's a hard piece of land, Miss Whitmore. Hard for your father, God rest him, and he was out there 30 years. I know the land, she said. Do you have family coming, brothers and uncle? No. He looked at her the way men always looked at her when she said things like that. Like she had said something in a foreign language and he was waiting for a translation that made more sense. A woman alone up there, he said carefully. That's not an easy situation. I know that too, Clara said. Can I get my seed? He got her seed. She was paying when the door opened behind her and 2 men came in. Clara recognized one of them, Roy Caldwell, who worked for his uncle Nathan at the big ranch on the valley floor. Roy was younger than her, broad-shouldered, with a mouth that was always slightly curved, like he was permanently in on a joke no one else had been told. "Well," he said, looking at her. "Miss Whitmore, heard about your daddy. Real sorry." "Thank you," she said, and turned back to the counter. "What are you buying?" He leaned over to look at her order without being invited to. "Seed what for?" "For planting." "You're staying out there." "I am." Roy looked at the man beside him. Something passed between them. "Miss Whitmore," he said in the tone of a man explaining something obvious to a child, "that land your daddy had the soil's not right for winter wheat. Never has been. That's why he could never quite make it work." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm also putting in turnips. The altitude's too high for yit, Mr. Caldwell." She looked at him directly. "I appreciate your concern, but my father worked that land for 30 years and I grew up on it. I know what grows there." His smile didn't change. "Your daddy tried for 30 years and never turned a real profit." "No," she agreed. "He didn't, but my father was a man who loved horses more than farming and he spent his time accordingly." She picked up her parcel from the counter. "I intend to do it differently." She left before he could answer. Outside, she loaded the seed into her wagon. Her hands were steady. She kept them that way through an act of will she was getting better at every day. She was climbing up to the seat when she heard the door of the store open again. "Miss Whitmore." Roy Caldwell came out and stood at the side of the wagon, squinting up at her with that same curved smile. "My uncle's been looking at your land." She looked down at him. "Is that right?" "He made your daddy an offer, 2 years back. Fair offer." "I know. My father didn't take it. Your daddy had reasons to be sentimental. You're in a different situation." He rested one hand on the side of the wagon, casual, like he owned it. "You're alone. Winter'll come around again. What happened this year was mild. Next year could go different." Clara picked up the reins. "Tell your uncle thank you for his interest. He'll offer a good price." "He can offer it in a letter," she said. "Same answer." She clicked her tongue at the horse and pulled out. She didn't look back. Chapo. She was 2 miles outside of Harlan when the wagon wheel hit a rut in the road and the axle made a sound she didn't like. She pulled the horse to a stop and climbed down to look. The axle wasn't broken, not yet, but there was a crack running along the side that hadn't been there when she'd set out that morning, or if it had, she hadn't noticed it. Either way, it was there now. Clara stood in the road and looked at the crack and thought about what it would take to get home with a compromised axle on a road that was going to get rougher before it got better. She could push the horse and hope it held. She could drive slowly and almost certainly make it at the cost of another hour each way. She could take a different route that added distance but was smoother. She was working through the options when she heard hoofbeats on the road behind her. She turned. A man on horseback was coming down the road at an easy pace. He slowed when he saw her wagon stopped, and she watched him make the calculation she'd seen other travelers make, whether to pass by or stop. Most passed by. A woman alone on the road could be trouble of one kind or another, and most people preferred not to inherit trouble. This man stopped. He pulled up about 10 yards away and looked at her wagon and then at her. He was tall in the saddle. She could see that even from a distance. Lean in the way of men who worked physically and didn't eat more than they burned. Leather vest. Sun-worn hat. The kind of face that had spent so much time in the weather, it had decided to just become part of it. He had a rifle on his back and a bedroll behind his saddle. No wagon, no pack animal. Just the horse and what he was carrying. "Trouble?" he asked. He had a low voice. "Careful." "Cracked axle," she said. "I'm assessing." He swung down from his horse in one motion and walked toward her, leading the horse by the reins. He came to where she was standing and looked at the axle without touching it. He was quiet for a long moment. "It'll hold to town," he said. "Won't hold much past." "I'm not going to town. I'm coming from it." He looked at her. "Where are you headed?" 14 acres on the east slope, about 7 miles. He looked at the axle again, looked at the road ahead of them. She could see him calculating the same things she had been. Road gets rougher before the slope, he said. I know. That axle hits one of those rocks wrong, the wheel comes off. Wagon tips. Horse panics. I know that too, she said. She wasn't being sharp with him, she was just being honest. She knew the risks. She was deciding how to handle them. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I can ride ahead, check the road. The worst of the ruts I can fill with what's loose on the shoulder. He paused. Won't fix it, but might get you home. Clara looked at him. Men on the road offered help for different reasons. She had learned to read the difference. She read this man for a moment. He was looking at the axle, not at her. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't performing. Why? She asked. He glanced at her briefly. Why what? Why would you do that? He thought about it. Honest thought, not a deflection. I'm going that direction anyway, he said. And I know what it's like when nobody comes. It was a strange thing to say. She filed it away. All right, she said. I'll take it slow. You ride ahead. He nodded, climbed back on his horse, started up the road. She got back on the wagon and followed, giving him 100 yards of distance. He did what he said he would. She could see him ahead, stopping at the worst places, working the loose rock on the shoulder, with his boots sometimes dismounting and using his hands. By the time she reached each spot, it was at least passable, the sharpest edges knocked down. Not smooth, but survivable. They went 7 miles that way. When she turned into the track that led up to her farm, he stopped his horse at the main road. She pulled the wagon to a halt and turned to look at him. Thank you, she said. He looked up the track at her farmhouse visible on the slope. Something moved across his expression, not quite recognition. Something closer to an old memory that had pushed itself unexpectedly to the surface. You live up there alone? He asked. I do. Your husband? There is no husband. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Ethan Walker, he said, just his name. Like that was the whole explanation. Clara Whitmore, she said. He nodded once, pulled his horse around, and started back the way they'd come. She watched him go for a moment, then turned the wagon up the track. She didn't expect to see him again. She was wrong. 2 mornings later, she came out to the barn at first light and found her east fence repaired, not patched properly, replaced. New posts, new wire, the kind of work that would hold. She stood at the fence and ran her finger along the wire and tried to think of who could have done it. There was only one answer. She looked toward the road. Nothing there. Just the slope and the summer morning and the sound of the creek running below the property. She didn't go looking for him. She went back to work. But the following morning, the loose board on the barn siding was nailed. The morning after that, the latch on the gate that had been sticking for 2 months moved clean and smooth. She never heard him. She never saw him arrive or leave, just the evidence of what he'd done waiting for her every time she stepped outside. On the 4th morning, she left a plate of biscuits on the fence post. When she came back out an hour later, the plate was empty. She found him on the 5th day. She had gone down to the creek to check the irrigation channel, and she found him there crouched at the edge of the bank, clearing a section that had silted up over the winter. His hat was on the ground beside him. His sleeves were rolled up. He was working with his hands the way he did everything she was learning, quietly, methodically, like work was a language he understood better than any other. He heard her coming and looked up. He didn't startle. "You've been fixing things," she said. "Some." She looked at the channel. He'd cleared a good 10 feet of it. "I would have gotten to this," she said. "I know. I'm not helpless." "I know that too." He went back to the work. She watched him for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't answer right away. He cleared another foot of the channel, the mud coming away in slow, thick clumps, before he sat back on his heels and looked up at her. "I have a place," he said. 8 miles north up the ridge. I've been there 6 years. Alone. Alone. She waited. I come down the slope most mornings, he said. Check the lower trails. Make sure nothing's come through. He paused. I saw your father's place when he was still keeping it. Saw when he got sick. Saw you come home. She felt something tighten in her chest. Not anger. Something more complicated. You watched. I noticed, he said. There was a difference in those words, and she could hear that he knew it. First winter you were here, the creek flooded the south corner of the field. I moved some rock to divert it. You probably saw the water changed course and didn't know why. She thought back. She had noticed that. She'd assumed her father had done something years ago that she was only now seeing the result of. You've been watching over this place? She said. The land runs close to mine, he said simply. What happens here affects what happens there. It was a practical explanation. She didn't entirely believe it was the whole one. Why didn't you come down and say something? She asked. He looked at the creek. Some folks don't want company. And some do. He glanced up at her. Some do, he agreed. Clara sat down on the bank a few feet from where he was working. Not close, just near enough to talk without raising her voice. You knew my father? She asked. Not well. He came up to the ridge once about 4 years ago looking for a stray. We talked a little. He seemed like a good man. He was, she said. He was a very good man who was better with horses than with farming, and who would have given the land away to a stranger before he let anyone think he needed help. She paused. He died not knowing how bad the finances were. Or maybe he knew and decided not to know. I'm not sure which. Ethan was quiet. There's debt, she said. It was the first time she'd said it plainly to anyone. Not enormous, but enough that if I don't turn a profit this year, I'll have to sell. Nathan Caldwell, he said. Not a question. She looked at him sharply. You know about that. Word gets around. Caldwell's been buying up land on the slope for 3 years. Your father's was the only piece he didn't get. He cleared another section of the channel. I expect Roy's already come to you. He came to the general store, she said. What did you tell him? I told him to have his uncle send a letter. She paused. Same answer, I'll give the letter. For just a moment, something changed in Ethan Walker's expression. It was subtle, a slight easing around the eyes, like a tension he'd been holding had shifted. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the same neighborhood. This irrigation channel, he said, if you clear it all the way to the upper bend, it'll water the whole east field without you carrying bucket. You'll need that for the winter wheat. She looked at him. Roy Caldwell told me winter wheat won't grow at this altitude. Roy Caldwell has never grown anything himself, Ethan said. He just watches other people fail and calls it knowledge. He stood up and brushed the mud from his hands. I'll show you the right seeding depth. The wheat'll grow. Clara stood up too. She was quiet for a moment, looking at this man who had spent 5 days quietly repairing her farm before she'd even found him. What do you want for this? She asked. He picked up his hat. Nothing. Nobody does nothing for nothing. He looked at her steadily. Then call it whatever makes you comfortable. Neighbor. Investment in the land. Habit. None of those are nothing. No, he said. They're not. He settled the hat on his head. I'll come back tomorrow. We can start on the channel. He walked back up the slope. Clara watched him go and felt something she hadn't felt in 8 months of working this land alone. She felt like she might actually not be doing this alone. She wasn't sure yet if that was a relief or a new kind of terrifying. Probably both, she decided. She went back to work. That evening, she sat on the sagging porch in the last light of the day and wrote a letter to her friend Margaret in Billings. Margaret had been asking her to come back for months. Come back to teaching. Come back to town. Come back to something that makes sense for a woman in your position, Clara. She started the letter 3 times. The first 2 times she didn't know what to say. The third time she wrote, I think I'm going to stay. I don't know if it's wise. I'm not sure wisdom is the right measure for some decisions. I had a man help me get home 2 days ago, and I'm starting to understand that what he said when I asked him why might be the truest thing anyone said to me in years. He said he knew what it felt like when nobody comes. I know what that feels like too. I think I might stay because of that. Because this land is one of the only things in my life right now that needs me to show up for it every single day. And showing up feels like the only thing I know how to do anymore. I'll write again when I have more news. She folded the letter and set it aside. The sun was all the way down now, and the mountains were dark shapes against a darkening sky. Somewhere up there, 8 miles north, a man was alone in a place he'd built and kept for 6 years. Clara didn't know his story yet, but she recognized the shape of it. She knew what it looked like when someone had learned to live without expecting help to come. She'd spent 8 months becoming that person herself. She went inside, and the door that still didn't close quite right stuck half an inch from the frame like it always did. And she pressed it shut with her shoulder, and thought not for the first time about what she'd need to do to fix that hinge. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow, she'd fix the hinge, clear the irrigation channel, and figure out what it meant to let someone help her without losing the thing she'd built inside herself these last 8 months. The hard, quiet certainty that she could do this. She was going to need all of it, every bit of it. She just wasn't sure yet that she had to do it alone. The next morning, Ethan was there before she finished her coffee. Clara heard boots on the ground outside, not on the porch, not knocking, just the sound of someone moving with purpose near the barn, and she came out to find him already crouched at the start of the irrigation channel with a short-handled spade, working from where he'd left off the day before. He didn't say good morning. He didn't look up. He just worked. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, her coffee still in her hand. "You could knock," she said. "Didn't want to wake you." "I've been up since before sunrise." He glanced up briefly. "So have I." She came down off the porch and walked over to where he was working. She crouched across the channel from him and pulled the second spade, her father's, which she'd found in the barn, from where she'd leaned it against the post the night before, expecting this. He looked at the spade, then at her. "You can do the east section," she said. "I'll work from the bend." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to help." "It's my channel," she said. Something moved across his expression. Not amusement quite. The near neighbor of it. They worked. It was different working beside someone. Clara had spent 8 months with the silence of the farm, so complete that she'd stopped noticing it. It had just become the texture of her days, like the weight of a shovel or the roughness of rope. She'd learned to fill it with her own thinking, planning the next task before the current one was done, running through lists and calculations and problems and solutions in a continuous current that kept the quiet from becoming something else. Working next to Ethan Walker, she noticed the silence again. Not because it was uncomfortable, because it had changed quality. It was 2 people quiet together rather than 1 person quiet alone, and those were entirely different things even when no words passed between them. By mid-morning, they had cleared the channel all the way to the upper bend. Clara stood up and pressed her hands against the small of her back and watched the water begin to move more freely, finding the path they'd opened for it. "You were right," she said, "about the east field." "I usually am about water," he said. He said it without pride, just as a statement of fact. "What else are you usually right about?" He thought about it, genuinely thought. "Weather," he said. "Reading animals, which wood holds and which doesn't." He paused. "Not much else." "That's a narrow list." "It's an honest one." Clara looked at him. He was standing with the spade handle resting against his shoulder, looking at the water moving through the channel, and she had the sense, she'd had it several times now, that he was a man who spent a great deal of time with his own thoughts and had made a kind of peace with them that she hadn't managed yet. "How long have you been up on that ridge?" she asked. 6 years. Before that." He was quiet for a moment. "Wyoming. Before that, Colorado. You moved around." "For a while." She waited to see if he'd say more. He didn't. "Ethan?" She said his name plainly, not to get his attention, but to mark what she was about to say as something she meant. I'm not asking out of nosiness. I'm asking because you know things about me. You watched this place. You know about my father. You know about the debt, and I know almost nothing about you except your name and the direction of your ridge." He looked at her. The directness of it seemed to catch him slightly off guard, though not in a way that made him retreat. "That's fair," he said. So, he set the spade against the fence post. "I had a family," he said. "Wife, a son. We had a small place in Wyoming, down in a valley near the Shoshone. Good land." He stopped, started again more carefully. "There was a flood, spring runoff 6 years back, the kind that comes fast and doesn't give you enough time." He didn't look away from the water moving through the channel. "I was up on the high ground when it came through, checking fencing. They were in the house." Clara went very still. "I didn't get back in time," he said. The words were simple. She understood that the simplicity was the result of a very long time spent learning how to say them without being destroyed by the saying. "Ethan." "I'm not telling you so. You'll feel sorry for me," he said quietly. "I'm telling you because you asked a fair question and you deserve a fair answer." He picked up the spade. "I came north, found the ridge, stayed. 6 years, she said. 6 years. She looked at him. This man with his worn hat and his careful hands, and his 6 years of silence on a mountain ridge, and felt something shift in her chest. Not pity. Something closer to recognition. The specific ache of someone who understood what it meant to reorganize yourself around a loss so total that it changed the shape of everything. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the loss." "Thank you," he said. "Just that. No deflection. No, the Lord has a plan, or it was a long time ago." She respected him for that. They went back to work. Bad. Over the next 2 weeks, a pattern formed. Ethan came down from the ridge most mornings. He arrived before she expected him and left before the day was done, always with enough light left that she could get more work in before dark. He didn't announce what he was going to do. He looked at what needed doing and did it, and if there was a task she was already partway through, he found a different one. She found she didn't mind. What she minded was the town. She'd gone back to Harlan for supplies on a Thursday, and this time she made it all the way through Miles Peabody's store before anything happened. It was on the street outside, walking back to the wagon, that she ran into Doris Hallett, who ran the boarding house, who had known Clara's father for 20 years, and who looked at Clara with the particular expression of a woman who thought she knew something and was making an effort to be kind about it. "Clara?" She touched Clara's arm. "I heard you've had some company out on the farm." Clara kept her expression neutral. "Word travels fast. Tom Garner rode past your track 2 days ago and saw a horse tied at your fence." Doris's voice was careful, the way of someone navigating something delicate. "A man's horse. He mentioned it to his wife." "Mr. Walker helped me repair the irrigation channel," Clara said. "He's a neighbor." Doris's eyebrows went up slightly. "Ethan Walker. I didn't know he came down from that ridge." "He does sometimes." "Clara." Doris lowered her voice, even though there was no one near enough to hear. "I'm not saying anything unkind, but you're a young woman alone, and people talk, and if Ethan Walker is spending time at your farm, then I have good help with my irrigation channel," Clara said, in the same tone she'd used to explain weather. She pulled her arm gently from Doris's grip. "Tell Tom Garner I said thank you for his concern." She got into the wagon and drove home. She was halfway there before the anger settled into something more tired than hot. It wasn't new this thing women alone were always supposed to be explaining themselves, justifying their choices, bracing against the assumption that any decision they made without a man's approval must be a mistake or a scandal. She'd known it coming home. She'd known it every day since. But knowing it and sitting inside it were different. When she pulled the wagon up to the farm, Ethan was on her porch. She pulled up short. He was sitting on the step, not inside, not making himself at home in any presumptuous way, just sitting on the step with his hat in his hands, waiting. He stood when she pulled up. "Your latch," he said. "On the door. I went to check it and found the whole hinge assemblies pulling loose from the frame. If you leave it, the door'll come off in a month." She climbed down from the wagon. "Can you fix it?" "Already did." He nodded toward the door. "You'll need to test it." She went up and opened the door. It moved clean, and even no sticking, no drag. She pushed it closed from the inside and felt it seat properly for the first time since she'd come home 8 months ago. She came back out. "The whole town knows you've been coming here," she said. "Not accusation, just information." He looked at her. "Does that bother you?" She thought about it. "It bothers me that it'll cost me something. Reputation's the only credit a woman alone can spend in a town like this, and once it's gone, it's gone." She leaned against the porch rail. "Does it bother you?" "I don't spend much time in Harlan," he said. "Lucky you." He was quiet a moment. "Do you want me to stop coming?" The question was direct and completely without self-pity. That was the thing about Ethan Walker, he didn't angle. He asked what he meant to ask. Clara looked at her repaired door. At the east fence she could see from here properly replaced. At the channel whose water she could hear moving more freely across the east field. "No," she said. "I don't." Something settled in the lines of his face. "Then let them talk." "Easy for you to say." "Maybe," he allowed. "But you don't seem like a woman who makes decisions based on what Roy Caldwell thinks." She looked at him sharply. "Has Roy Caldwell said something?" Ethan's expression shifted not much, but she was starting to learn his face, the small degrees of it. "He came up to the ridge yesterday." Clara went still. "He came to your property." "Rode up to the fence. Said he wanted to make sure I understood the situation." He set his hat back on his head. "He said Nathan Caldwell was still interested in the Whitmore land, and that if I was spending time here, I ought to know I was wasting it." The heat that came up in her chest wasn't the tired kind. It was the sharp kind. "He said that to you?" "Among other things." "What other things?" Ethan looked at her steadily. Nothing worth repeating. Which meant it had been about her. She understood that without him having to say it. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him to get off my land." A pause. "He left." "He left." Clara let out a slow breath. "He'll go back to his uncle." "He will. And Nathan Caldwell will come himself next time." "Probably." Ethan said it without alarm. Just as a fact to account for. "When he does, what are you going to tell him?" "The same thing I told Roy." She straightened up from the rail. "No." This time what crossed Ethan Walker's face was absolutely unmistakably something that had once been a smile and still remembered how. Nathan Caldwell came on a Tuesday. Clara was in the barn when she heard the wagon. She came out to find a man she'd seen twice from a distance, thick-set gray at the temples, with the solid and certain manner of a man who had spent 40 years getting his way in small increments and had never quite learned to account for the possibility of not getting it. He climbed down from his wagon with the deliberateness of age and comfort combined, and he took his hat off when he reached her, which was more than Roy had done. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Nathan Caldwell. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said. "Your father was a man I respected," he said. "We didn't always agree, but I respected him." He looked around the yard with the particular gaze of a man calculating rather than seeing. "He worked hard out here." "He did. As I understand it, the land's carrying some debt." "You understand correctly." He nodded. "I want to make you a fair offer, Miss Whitmore. Not the kind of offer Roy makes. I know how he comes across, and I apologize for it. I want to make you a genuine fair offer. Enough to pay the debt and have something left over. Enough to start something new." He named a number. It was fair. That was the worst of it. It was genuinely, objectively fair. It was more than the land was worth on paper, and they both knew it, and they both knew the reason he was offering more than paper value was that he wanted it badly enough to pay for the wanting. Clara looked at him. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why do you want this particular piece so much? You have 3,000 acres in the valley. My 14 looks small from where you stand. He was quiet for a moment. He was a man who chose his words carefully, she could see that. The water, he said finally. The creek that runs through your east corner. It drains into the valley floor. I have a proposal in front of the county to redirect it, run it through a series of channels to the south fields. Your land is the linchpin. Without it, the whole proposal falls apart. She absorbed this. So this land is worth considerably more to you than you're offering. A slight pause. It's worth what I'm offering. That's not what I asked. He looked at her with a new quality of attention, the kind a man gives when he realizes he's underestimated someone and is rapidly recalibrating. Miss Whitmore. No, she said. He blinked. I haven't. Your answer is no, Mr. Caldwell. Not today. Not in a letter next week. Not in 6 months when the debt is more pressing. She said it without heat because heat would have given him something to manage. She said it the way you say something that is simply true. This land belonged to my father, and it belongs to me. The water in that creek runs through this soil, and it will keep running through it. That's not for sale. Caldwell put his hat back on. His expression had gone flat in a way that Roy's never had. Roy went to amusement when he was frustrated, as if contempt were easier to wear. Nathan Caldwell went still. The debt will come due, he said. I know. And when it does, I'll handle it, she said. Good day, Mr. Caldwell. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and got back in his wagon. She watched him drive down the track, and she kept her breathing even, and she did not let her hands shake until he was completely out of sight. Then she sat down on the porch step and pressed her palms flat against her knees and breathed. That was when she heard boots on the ground around the side of the house. She looked up. Ethan came around the corner of the barn. He'd been there. She didn't know for how long. You heard, she said. Some of it. The water, she said. The East Creek, it's the whole thing. That's what he wants. Ethan sat down on the step beside her, leaving a proper distance. I know about the water proposal. It's been in front of the county commission for 8 months. If he gets the rights to redirect it, he can double the output on his south fields. And my land is the linchpin. Your land is the linchpin. She looked at him. You knew this before. He met her eyes. I knew he wanted the land. I didn't know about the water proposal until last week. Tom Garner mentioned it in passing. Last week, she said. I was going to tell you. When? He was quiet for a moment. When I'd figured out what it meant for you, what the options were. He paused. I didn't want to bring you a problem without also having thought through the answer. Clara looked at him for a long moment. It was a particular kind of infuriating, the kind where someone did something with entirely good intentions that still removed a choice from you without asking. She recognized the impulse in herself. She'd spent her whole life solving things before she told anyone there was a problem, so that she wouldn't have to watch them worry. Don't do that, she said. Don't do what? Don't protect me from information about my own land. Her voice was level. I can handle problems. What I can't handle is people deciding for me what I'm strong enough to know. He absorbed this. You're right, he said without qualification or defense. I'm sorry. She hadn't expected that, not so plainly. She exhaled. What are the options? She asked. The water, he said. If you file a prior appropriation claim on the East Creek through the county, establish that you've been using it for agriculture. Caldwell can't redirect it without your agreement, regardless of what the commission says. It doesn't solve the debt. But it takes the linchpin away. If he can't get the creek, the land's worth a fair price to him instead of a high price. The pressure eases. How do I file? County seat. Helena. You need documentation of use irrigation records, planting history. Anything that shows the water's been in agricultural use on this property. My father kept records, she said. In the house. I haven't gone through all of them. Then that's where we start, he said. We. The word was casual. He probably hadn't noticed he'd said it that way. She had. "All right," she said. "Come inside." They spent the better part of the afternoon on the floor of the front room with her father's papers spread around them. Thomas Whitmore had been a meticulous record keeper in some ways and chaotic in others. He had detailed horse breeding logs going back 20 years kept in leather-bound books with careful handwriting. His farming records were less tidy. Scraps of paper notes in the margins of almanacs, a ledger that had been used inconsistently for 15 years, and then apparently abandoned in favor of an old tobacco tin full of folded notes. Clara went through the ledger. Ethan went through the tobacco tin. "What are we looking for exactly?" she asked. "Dates of planting, references to irrigating, anything that shows the creek water was used for crops." He unfolded a small piece of paper, looked at it, set it in a pile. "The prior appropriation system works on first use. Your father's been farming here 30 years. If we can show continuous use of that water for agriculture, your claim predates anything Caldwell has filed." "Daddy would have thought a water claim was unnecessary," Clara said. "He would have said the creek was on his land and that was that." "Most people do," Ethan said, "until someone wants it." She found the first reference an hour in a planting record from 1871 with a note in her father's hand about the East Field needing more irrigation than the creek was providing in dry months. She set it aside. Ethan found a letter from a neighbor who'd since moved away, thanking Thomas Whitmore for allowing water to be diverted from the creek for a week during a dry spell. The date was 1869. It named the creek and the property. "This is good," Ethan said. She looked up. He was holding the letter, carefully reading it again. "That's good?" she asked. "This is very good," he said. "A letter from a neighbor naming the water source and acknowledging your father's right to it. This is exactly what a claim needs." He looked up at her. "Your father didn't know he was documenting anything, but he was." Clara took the letter and read it. The handwriting was faded, but legible. She folded it back carefully and held it. "He would have liked you," she said. Ethan looked up. "Why?" "Because you care about the right things." She set the letter in the documentation pile. "He always said you could tell a man's character by what he thought was worth saving." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he looked back at the tobacco tin. "Let's keep looking." They found 11 more references before the light went. Clara dated them, organized them, wrapped them in cloth to keep them clean. When they finally stood up from the floor, the front room was dim with early evening. Clara lit the lamp. The yellow light changed everything, softened, it warmed, it made the room feel closer than it had. She looked at Ethan across the papers, still spread on the floor, and she had a thought she didn't intend to have, and couldn't entirely account for that. This was the first evening in 8 months that the front room hadn't felt like a place where someone used to live. She didn't say it. She put the lamp on the table and said, "I'll make something to eat." And he said, "I should get back before dark." And she said, "You have a half hour before dark." And he stopped and looked at her and didn't argue. She made cornbread from what she had. He sat at the kitchen table and didn't offer to help. She hadn't asked, and he seemed to understand that the kitchen was her territory. And he looked at the wall above the door where her father had hung a horseshoe. "He put that up when you were born," she said, not looking away from the stove. "He said a house with a girl in it needed all the luck it could get." "He wasn't wrong," Ethan said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the horseshoe, not at her, and his expression was something she hadn't quite seen on him before. Not sad, not exactly. Something adjacent to sad that had learned to be still. She turned back to the stove. They ate without talking much, which was fine. It was the same kind of quiet as the work, not empty, just restful. When he stood to leave, he picked up his hat from the peg by the door. "I'll ride to Helena with you," he said, "when you're ready to file. I know the county clerk. He's a careful man, he'll do it right." "I can go alone," she said. "I know you can." He paused at the door. "But I know the clerk and the roads between here and Helena have gotten worse since spring. 2 days by wagon, and the second day the road goes through some rough country." He held her gaze. I'm not saying you need me. I'm saying I'd like to come. She looked at him. This careful, quiet man who had spent 6 years on a ridge alone and still managed to know the county clerk in Helena. All right, she said. He nodded. He put on his hat. Ethan, she said before he reached the porch. He turned. What you told me this morning, she said. About Wyoming, about your family. She paused. Thank you for telling me. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Thank you for asking a fair question, he said, and then he walked out into the evening, and she heard his horse pick up from the fence post and start up the slope toward the ridge, and she stood in the kitchen with the cornbread cooling on the table, and the lamp burning, and the horseshoe above the door, and she thought about fair questions, and the people who answer them honestly. She thought it was one of the rarer things in the world than most people counted. She blew out the lamp and went to bed and slept better than she had in weeks, which surprised her in the morning when she thought about it. Though maybe it shouldn't have. They left for Helena on a Thursday. Clara had the documentation wrapped and packed, and she brought her father's ledger as backup. She wore her good dress, not her best, because her best was a pale green thing that she'd worn to school graduations, and which felt wrong for a county clerk's office, but the dark blue one that had a collar that didn't fray and a hem that was still solid. Ethan met her at the track junction at first light, with his horse packed for 2 days. He looked at her wagon, looked at her and said, "You're prepared." "Always," she said. It came out lighter than she intended. She didn't correct it. The road to Helena was long, and she was right that the second day was rough, and Ethan was right that it was better not to travel it alone. Not because she couldn't have managed, she could have, but because having someone ride ahead at the worst sections, someone who knew this particular terrain in a way that came from years of moving through it, meant they made Helena in a day and a half instead of 2. They stayed at separate boarding houses, which she had already arranged and which he hadn't questioned. The county clerk was a small man named Gerald Adair, who wore spectacles and had the kind of quiet authority of a person who understood that the paperwork was the power. He went through the documentation with great care. He looked up at Ethan once, then back at the papers. "This is solid," he said. "The 1869 letter alone would establish prior claim. The planting records corroborate. I can file this today." He looked at Clara. "You understand what you're filing? This is a formal claim on the appropriation rights to the water source identified as the East Creek of the Whitmore property. Once filed, any redirection or reassignment of that water source requires your written agreement." "I understand," she said. "Nathan Caldwell has a pending proposal before the county commission." "I know," she said. He looked at her over his spectacles. "Miss Whitmore, once this is filed, that proposal dies. Caldwell will know it the same day." "File it," she said. Adair looked at Ethan briefly. Ethan said nothing. He was looking at Clara. Adair filed it. They were back on the road before noon. They were an hour outside of Helena when Ethan spoke. "He'll know tonight," he said. "I know. He'll be angry, probably. He has more resources than you do, Clara. Moneymen, connections to the commission." He said it straight. "This doesn't end the fight. It changes the shape of it." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I know that, but now I have something I didn't have this morning." "What's that?" She turned to look at him. "Now I have a legal right to say no. Before I just had nerve." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the road. "Nerve got you further than most people manage," he said quietly. She turned her face forward and let the wagon carry her toward home, and felt for the first time since she'd put her father in the ground that she was not only surviving this, she was building something. And somewhere beside her, on a horse that moved quiet and steady on the road, was a man who had stopped believing he deserved to build anything at all. She hadn't figured out yet what to do about that, but she was starting to think that was the next problem worth solving. They were 3 days back from Helena when Nathan Caldwell made his next move. Clara found out from Miles Peabody, who told her with the careful discomfort of a man delivering bad news he hadn't asked to carry. She'd come in for flour and salt, and he'd leaned across the counter and said quietly like he was confessing something, "Miss Whitmore, I think you ought to know. Caldwell's been talking to people." "What kind of talking?" she asked. "The kind that's about your water claim." He straightened a jar on the shelf behind him without looking at it. "He's saying the documentation you filed was falsified, that the 1869 letter was written recently and backdated." Clara went very still. "That's a lie." "I know it is," Peabody said. "I knew your father 30 years. That letter's real." He paused. "But Caldwell's saying it to the right people. Commission members, the county assessor. He's building a case that the claim should be challenged. He can challenge it all he wants. The clerk accepted it." "Gerald Adair accepted it," Peabody said. "But Gerald Adair answers to the county commissioner, and the county commissioner had dinner with Nathan Caldwell last Friday night." Clara set her money on the counter. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "What will you do?" She picked up her parcel. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But I'll figure it out." She drove home faster than the road warranted. Ethan was at the east fence when she pulled in. He saw her face before she said a word, and put down his tools and walked toward her. "What happened?" he said. She told him. All of it quickly, without softening any piece of it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Adair's a careful man," he said. "He won't fold easy." "But he's not the last word," she said. "Caldwell knows that." "Who's the commissioner?" "A man named Harwick, Arthur Harwick. Do you know him?" Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "I know of him. He's been on the commission 12 years. Caldwell supported every re-election." He looked at the fence line, not at her, and she could see him thinking the same methodical working through that she'd watched him do in the barn at the creek over her father's papers. "We need a lawyer." "I can't afford a lawyer. There's a man in Helena, James Corbin. He handles land disputes for the smaller ranchers, the ones who can't pay full rate. He works on a percentage of what he saves you." He looked at her. "If Caldwell's going to challenge the documentation, you need someone who can stand in front of the commission and speak the law. Not just the letter. The law. Will he take the case?" "I'll write to him tonight." She looked at him. "You know a lot of people in Helena for a man who lives alone on a ridge." Something shifted in his expression, just slightly. "I didn't always live alone on a ridge." She absorbed that. There were layers to this man she hadn't reached yet, and she was beginning to understand they would come up when he was ready, and not before. "Write the letter," she said. He wrote it that evening at her kitchen table, which had become by some gradual and unplanned process the table where things got decided. She read it over when he was done. It was clear and direct, and gave Corbin exactly the information he needed without excess. She signed her name at the bottom because it was her claim and her land, and he didn't suggest otherwise. They sent it with the next rider through Harlan, and they waited. The waiting was its own kind of pressure. Clara worked through it the way she worked through everything, by staying in motion. The east field was planted now, winter wheat going in at the depth Ethan had shown her, the irrigation channel running clean and steady. The vegetable patch was producing more than she'd expected. The barn roof held through 2 summer thunderstorms that came through on consecutive nights, loud and sudden, rattling the shutters and sending the old horses into anxious circles in their stalls. Ethan came down from the ridge each morning and left each evening, and somewhere in the weeks since Helena the rhythm of it had stopped feeling temporary. It felt like a pattern, like something both of them had agreed to without quite saying so out loud. The town was still talking. Clara knew it and let it be. What the town said and what the town did were 2 different things, and it was the doing that mattered. What the town did in small and cautious ways was begin to look at her differently. It started with Ruth Garner. Tom Garner's wife, who had heard about the water claim from her husband and had put something together in her mind that she came to share on a Wednesday morning when she drove up the track unannounced with a jar of preserved peaches and an expression that was 2 parts guilt and 1 part admiration. "I owe you an apology," Ruth said at the door. "Tom told Doris Hallett about the horse at your fence. I know that caused you trouble. It wasn't his place." Clara looked at her. Ruth Garner was 50 years old, with the kind of face that had laughed a lot and weathered a lot, and was still fundamentally decent. "Come in," Clara said. They sat at the kitchen table with the peaches open between them, and Ruth said what she'd clearly come to say. "What you're doing with that water claim, there's 3 other ranchers on this slope who should have done the same thing 20 years ago and didn't. Caldwell's been picking us off one by one." She paused. "My husband thinks you've made a mistake, made a target of yourself." "And what do you think?" Clara asked. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I think if you win, it changes something." She picked up her jar. "I think that's worth some discomfort." It wasn't a declaration of war, but it was something. 3 days later, Frank Garner's neighbor, a rancher named Holt, who Clara had never spoken to directly, rode past her fence slowly enough that she knew it was deliberate and lifted his hat to her. That was all. But it was something, too. The letter from James Corbin arrived 12 days after they sent their own. Ethan read it first because he was at the table when Clara came in from the field, and she was covered in dirt, and her hands were shaking slightly from the work, and he'd already opened it before she'd thought to say she wanted to do it herself. She forgave him immediately because of what he said when he looked up from it. "He'll take the case," Ethan said. Clara stopped moving. "He knows Harwick." Ethan continued reading. "Says Harwick has a weakness, he's meticulous about procedure. He doesn't like process violations. If Caldwell's making informal accusations about the documentation without filing a formal challenge through the correct channels, Corbin can use that. Force a proper hearing, make Caldwell prove his claim in front of the whole commission instead of over dinner." He set the letter down. "Clara, this is a real chance." She came to the table and read the letter herself. Corbin wrote the way lawyers wrote, careful and dense, but the meaning was clear. He believed the claim was valid. He believed Caldwell had overplayed his hand by going to commission members privately rather than through official channels. He was willing to come to Harlan, review the original documents, and file a formal defense of the appropriation claim. His fee, if they won a percentage of the land's assessed value, paid over 3 years. Clara set the letter down. "That percentage over 3 years," she said. "It's manageable," Ethan said, "especially if the claim holds and Caldwell loses his proposal. He loses the proposal, the pressure on you eases. The land's worth less to him at fair market value." She looked at the letter, then at him. "How do you know so much about this?" she asked. "Land law, water rights, county commission procedure." He didn't answer right away. He straightened the letter on the table, aligning the edges with the corner. "Ethan," he looked up. "After Wyoming," he said carefully, "I spent 2 years trying to understand what I could have done differently. Not just with the flood, with the land. The deed was in both our names, and when she was gone, there were people who questioned whether it was mine alone. I had to learn the law." He paused. "I learned it thoroughly." Clara looked at him. This was another layer. Another room in a house she was only beginning to understand the layout of. "Did you keep the land?" she asked quietly. "No," he said. "I sold it. I didn't want it without them." He was looking at the table. "Sometimes I think that was the right decision. Sometimes I think it was the coward's one." "I don't think it was cowardice," she said. He looked up at her. "I think you were a man in the worst kind of grief, making the best decision he could with what he had left," she said. "That's not cowardice. That's survival." He was very still for a moment. "Write to Corbin," she said. "Tell him yes." He nodded and picked up the pen. Corbin arrived in Harlan on a Monday, and they met him at the hotel. The only hotel in Harlan which had 4 rooms and a parlor that smelled of pipe tobacco and old wood. He was younger than Clara had expected. Mid-30s, dark-suited, with a precise way of moving and talking that communicated competence without arrogance. He shook her hand before he shook Ethan's, which she noticed. He spent 2 hours with the documentation. When he was done, he set it all flat on the table in front of him and said, The 1869 letter is genuine. I can see it in the paper, the ink oxidation, the handwriting variation that happens naturally over a document's lifetime. A forger works too carefully. The variations are too consistent. This letter was written by a man on an ordinary afternoon with no intention of it ever being significant. "Can you prove that in a hearing?" she asked. "I can bring in someone who can." He tapped the letter. "There's an examiner in Missoula works with courts on document authenticity. His testimony would settle the question." He looked at her. "The question, Miss Whitmore, isn't whether your documents are real. They are. The question is whether Caldwell can convince the Commission to move against an established claim based on his word alone. And the answer to that in a formal hearing is no." He paused. "But he has to get to the formal hearing. Right now he's operating in the informal space. My job is to pull him into the formal one." "How?" Ethan asked. "I file a motion for a declaratory hearing on the appropriation claim. It forces the Commission to take a formal position. Either they affirm your claim or they challenge it in an official proceeding. They can't just let Caldwell talk it to death in private." He looked at Clara. "It'll make him angry." "He's already angry," she said. "Angrier," Corbin said. "Cornered men do things that aren't smart. That can work in your favor, or it can make things harder before they get easier." He looked at her steadily. "You need to be prepared for harder." "I've been preparing since I got here," she said. Corbin looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing. Corbin said, "I'll file Monday." Caldwell's response came not through a lawyer, not through the Commission, but through Roy. Roy Caldwell rode to her farm on a Thursday morning. Not to the fence line this time, all the way up the track right into the yard, and he didn't dismount, which told Clara this wasn't a conversation he intended to be long. She came out of the barn and looked up at him. "Morning, Roy." "Miss Whitmore." He wasn't smiling this time. "My uncle wants you to know that filing that motion was a mistake. Is that a message or a threat?" "It's information." He looked around the yard with a deliberateness that was meant to communicate something about who had power here. "He also wants you to know that he's looked into the deed on your property. There's a question about the survey line on your north boundary." Clara went still. "What kind of question?" she said. "The kind that might put some of your east field on Caldwell land." He said it the way you'd say the weather casual flat, like it was just facts. He hasn't decided whether to pursue it. He's leaving that decision open. In other words, withdraw the water claim or find out what else he'll take from you. She looked at Roy Caldwell on his horse in her yard, and she felt something that was past anger. Anger was a heat. This was something colder and more precise. "Roy," she said, "tell your uncle something for me." "All right. Tell him I've read the original survey record from 1868. My father had a copy, and I've been through every piece of paper in this house." She hadn't. But she'd been through most of them, and she was going to finish that night. "If there's a boundary question, I'll know it before his surveyor does. And if there isn't one, and I believe there isn't, then what he's describing is intimidation, which Mr. Corbin will find very interesting." Roy's expression changed, just slightly. Something in him recalculated. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I am." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode down the track. Clara went back into the barn and found the survey record. It took her 3 hours to locate it. It was in the second of her father's horse breeding ledgers, folded and tucked into the back cover like a bookmark. The handwriting was a surveyor's hand, careful and notated, and the boundary lines were clear. The north boundary was exactly where it had always been. She set the survey record on the table where the documentation lived and pressed both hands flat on it and breathed. Then she heard hooves on the track and looked up. Through the window, she saw Ethan coming down from the ridge at a pace that was faster than his usual. He dismounted at the fence and came up to the house quickly, and she met him on the porch. "Roy Caldwell was here," he said. He'd seen the tracks. He came with a message, she said. She told him about the survey threat. She told him she'd found the record. Ethan looked at the record in her hands. He read it carefully, standing on the porch. "The north boundary's clean," he said. "I know. Caldwell knows too." He handed it back. "This was a test. He wanted to see if you'd fold." "I didn't fold." "No?" he said. "You didn't." He looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read, something layered, something that had more underneath it than the surface allowed. "Clara, when the commission hearing is called, Caldwell's going to come hard. Everything he has. He's a man who's spent 40 years getting what he wants, and you're the first person in a long time who said no and made it stick. Men like that don't stop. They escalate." "I know." "Are you ready for that?" She looked at him. "Are you asking me if I want to quit?" "No," he said immediately and plainly. "I know you won't quit. I'm asking if you're ready. There's a difference." She thought about it. Really thought. She thought about her father who had loved this land without being able to save it. She thought about the 8 months alone, and the work, and the grief, and the growing feeling, stubborn and persistent, as the winter wheat, that she was making something here that was worth the cost. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." He nodded. Then something happened that she hadn't expected. He sat down on the porch step, not moving to leave, not heading back to the ridge, just sitting down like a man who had decided to stay a while, and looked out at the east field, which was coming in green and strong. And he said very quietly, "When I was in Wyoming, before, my wife used to say that the difference between surviving and living was whether you had something you were willing to fight for." Clara sat down on the step beside him. "Not far. Close. She sounds like she was a wise woman," Clara said. "She was," he said. "The wisest I ever knew." He paused. "Until recently." The words landed softly. He wasn't looking at her when he said them, but she heard them. She didn't say anything. Sometimes the right answer to something like that was just to let it exist in the air between two people. They sat on the porch together until the evening light changed, and neither of them felt the need to fill it. The commission hearing was set for the second week of August. It was the driest summer anyone in the valley could remember. The creek ran lower than Clara had ever seen it, still running, still serving the east field, but lower. The grass on the slope was the color of old straw by July's end. The wind came hot off the mountains and didn't cool at night the way it should. Ethan noticed it before she did. "The ridge is dry," he said one morning, looking north. He said it the way he said things about weather, not alarmed, not casual. With the attention of a man who had learned to trust what the land told him. "How dry?" she asked. "Dry enough." He looked at the sky. "We haven't had rain in 6 weeks. The creek's still holding." "The creek comes from snowmelt," he said. "The melt's done. What's left is what's stored." He looked at her. "We should check the fire breaks." She didn't know exactly what fire breaks they had. Her father had maintained some clearing on the south and west sides where the slope ran toward denser timber. But she hadn't thought about them specifically. As fire breaks, she'd thought of them as cleared land, useful for grazing. They walked the boundaries that afternoon. Ethan moved along the edge of the clearing with the eye of a man who knew what he was looking for, testing the brush with his boot, checking how it fell. "This side's all right," he said of the south clearing. "There's enough gap." He moved around the west corner and stopped. "This isn't." The west side had grown back considerably over the past 2 seasons. The brush pressed close to the fence line, dry and tangled and close-packed. "How much does it need to be cleared?" she asked. "Enough to matter," he said. He looked at the sky again. The sky that hadn't produced rain in 6 weeks. "We should do it now, not later." They spent 3 days clearing the west side. It was brutal work in the heat, swinging and dragging and hauling, their hands blistered and their shirts soaked through by mid-morning. Ethan worked without complaint and without slowing, and Clara matched his pace because she refused not to. On the second evening, when they'd come back to the farmhouse and she'd poured water from the bucket over her hands, she looked at him across the yard and said, "You've seen fire before." He was still. "Yes." "Bad." "Yes." She didn't push. She could hear in that single word the specific weight of a memory he wasn't ready to open. They finished the clearing on the third day. That night, Clara lay in bed and listened to the wind and thought about water and fire, and the dry creak of the summer pressing down on everything. She thought about Ethan Walker, who had lost his family to a flood and come north and spent 6 years alone, and who now spent his days repairing someone else's fences and clearing someone else's fire breaks and sitting on someone else's porch. She thought about what his wife had said. The difference between surviving and living was whether you had something you were willing to fight for. She thought Ethan Walker had been surviving for 6 years. She wasn't sure yet what it would take to get him living again. But she was starting to think she knew. The fire started on a Tuesday. Clara smelled it before she saw it, that particular heaviness in the air, the way smoke carries on a dry wind before the source is visible. She came out of the barn at mid-morning and stood in the yard and turned her face into the wind and felt her stomach drop. West. It was coming from the west. She ran to the fence line and looked toward the ridge. There was smoke rising, not close, not yet, but real and rising, and not the kind that stops by itself. The wind was carrying it east, toward the valley, toward her farm. She ran back and got her horse saddled in 4 minutes flat. She was heading for the gate when Ethan came down the slope at a gallop, faster than she'd ever seen him ride. And she pulled up, and he pulled up beside her, and his face was tight and clear. "It started above the Holt place," he said, breathing hard. "Dry lightning last night, I think. I saw the smoke from the ridge at first light and came down." He looked west. "The wind's wrong. It's pushing it southeast." "Toward us," she said. "Toward the whole valley, but us first." He looked at the farm, at the fence line they'd cleared, at the horses in the paddock, all 4 of them, the old ones and the younger pair she'd been working. "The horses need to go first." "Where?" "Creek bottom, east side. It's the lowest point, and the creek gives it some protection." He looked at her. "I'll take them down. You get the papers." "The papers?" "The water claim documentation, the survey record, everything in that cloth bundle on the table." He was already moving. "If the farm burns, you'll need them more than anything else you own." She ran to the house. She grabbed the cloth bundle from the table. She grabbed her father's horse breeding ledgers, all of them an armful, because they were 30 years of his work, and she couldn't leave them. She grabbed the horseshoe from above the door without knowing why she did it. She came out to find Ethan already moving the horses through the paddock gate. The old mare was balking. She could smell the smoke, and it was working on her in the deep animal way that was older than anything else in her. Ethan spoke to her in a low, continuous murmur and kept his hand on her neck, and she went reluctantly but steadily down toward the creek. Clara followed with her arms full and her heart slamming in her chest. The creek bottom was lower and greener than the slope, and it gave the horses something to stand on that wasn't dry brush. Ethan tied them on long lines to the heavy trees at the bank, and they pulled and circled and didn't settle, but they stayed. He turned to Clara. "We need to wet down the barn." "With what? The creek's low." "It's low. It's not empty." He was already moving toward the barn. "Bucket line from the creek, enough to wet the walls and the roof. It won't save it if the fire comes close enough, but it'll slow it." "Ethan!" "Bucket line," he said, and handed her the first bucket. They ran bucket lines for 2 hours, back and forth, creek to barn, creek to house. The water sloshed and soaked, and they were both drenched and exhausted, and the smoke was coming closer. She could taste it now. The air had a texture to it that made her chest tight. Around her in the larger distance, she could hear the valley responding shouts from neighboring farms. The sound of horses moving someone's wagon on the road going east and fast. The fire was drawing a line across the summer. She came around the corner of the barn with a full bucket and found Ethan on his knees in the yard. He'd tripped on a root she'd been meaning to clear for weeks, and he'd gone down hard on his right side, and he was pushing himself up, but something was wrong with his arm. He was using the left to push and holding the right against his body, and his face was tight with something he was not going to call pain. "Ethan." She set the bucket down and went to him. "I'm all right." "You're not." She crouched beside him. "Let me see." "Clara, let me see." He let her look. His right arm from the elbow down was scraped badly where he'd hit the ground, and when she pressed carefully above the wrist, he sucked in a breath that he tried to make small. "You could have broken it," she said. "It's not broken." "How do you know?" "Because I've broken it before," he said. "And this isn't that. It's bruised. I can still move it." He demonstrated slowly and with obvious effort. It moved. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was kneeling in the yard with smoke in the air, and his arm hurt, and there was still water to be carried, and she saw on his face the same expression she'd been watching all summer, the one that said, "I will do this alone. I will handle this. I don't need." "You do need," she said out loud without planning to. He looked at her confused. "Help," she said. "You need help." She picked up the bucket. "And right now what you need is to get up and let me carry the water while you check the west fence because you can see things about fire that I can't. That's how we do this." He looked at her for a moment. Something in him shifted, not breaking, but bending. The way a good fence post bends in the wind instead of snapping. He got up. "West fence," he said. "West fence," she agreed. He went. She carried the water. She made 8 more trips to the creek. On the 9th trip back, she stopped. The fire line to the west had slowed. She couldn't see it yet, not with her eyes, but she could feel it in the smoke, the way it was no longer thickening, the way the wind had shifted just slightly from the worst possible direction. Not perfectly. Not safely. But enough. Ethan came back from the west fence. "It's going south," he said. "The Holt place is in its path, but it's moving away from us." He stopped beside her, and they both stood looking west, reading the smoke. The fire break held. "The fire break held," she repeated. They had cleared that brush 3 days ago, both of them in the heat-blistered hands and aching backs, and the fire break they'd built with 3 days of brutal work had just done exactly what a fire break was supposed to do. Clara pressed one hand flat over her mouth. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry and too relieved for tears to feel like an adequate response to anything. She just stood with her hand over her mouth and breathed and felt the feeling pass through her and out the other side. Ethan stood beside her. Close. Not touching. Just there. "You knew?" she said after a moment. "When you said the ridge was dry, you knew this was a real possibility." "I suspected. That's why we cleared the brush." "Yes." She lowered her hand, looked at him. He was smoke-stained and tired, and his right arm was going to be bruised for a week, and he was looking west with the same steady attention he gave to everything. "Ethan," she said. He turned. She didn't know exactly what she had intended to say next. She knew what was true, that this man had in the space of a summer quietly and systematically kept her alive and her farm alive, and had done it without ever once making her feel small for needing it. She knew that what she felt when she looked at him was not something she had words for that felt adequate, so she didn't use words. She stepped forward and put her arms around him carefully on his left side, clear of the hurt arm, and held on. He went still for a long moment. Then slowly, like a man remembering something he'd stopped believing was possible, he raised his left arm and held her back. They stood in the yard, smoke-stained and exhausted, while the fire moved away south and the creek ran in the distance and the horses shifted on their lines. She felt him breathe. She felt the way he held on, not desperately, not greedily, but with the careful steadiness of a man who had been given something he hadn't expected and was making sure he didn't break it. When they stepped back from each other, neither of them said anything for a moment. "Then, the horses," he said quietly. "The horses," she agreed. They went to bring them home, and somewhere in the smoke-tinged August air, something that had been building all summer arrived at the place it had been heading all along quietly, without announcement, the way the most important things always do. The Holt place lost its barn. Clara found out the next morning when Frank Holt's wife Vera rode up the track with her 2 youngest children and asked if she could leave them for a few hours while she and Frank dealt with the damage. She looked like a woman who had been awake for 30 hours and had passed through fear and come out the other side into the exhausted practicality that follows disaster. "Of course," Clara said immediately. Come in." Vera looked at the farm, at the barn, standing at the house, standing at the wet marks still visible on the walls from their bucket work the day before. "You didn't lose anything," she said, not with resentment, with something closer to wonder. "We cleared the brush on the west side 3 days ago," Clara said. "It made the difference." Vera looked at her. "Who told you to do that?" "Ethan Walker," Clara said. Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said with a plainness that held no calculation in it, "That man has lived on that ridge for 6 years and never once came down to introduce himself. Frank always said he was strange." She paused. "Frank was wrong." She left her children and rode back to her farm. Clara fed the children cornbread and kept them occupied while the morning moved, and she thought about what Vera Holt had said. 6 years on a ridge. Never came down to introduce himself. And yet somehow quietly, without ever making a point of it, Ethan Walker had been watching over everything below him. The farms, the boundaries, the water, the weather, like a man who had decided that caring from a distance was safer than caring up close. She understood it. She just wasn't sure she was willing to let it continue. Ethan came down at mid-morning. His right arm was wrapped. He'd done it himself. She could tell by the angle slightly awkward at the back, and he moved it carefully, but he moved it, and he didn't mention it when he came into the yard. He looked at the children sitting on the porch. "Holt's kids," Clara said. "How bad was their barn?" "Total loss," Vera said. "The house held." She leaned against the fence rail. "Ethan, we need to talk about the commission hearing." He looked at her. "That's still 10 days out." "I know. But after yesterday, the fire, the smoke, people evacuating, I want to know where things stand." She kept her voice even. "Caldwell didn't come out for any of it. He was in town. Everyone knows it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Roy was in Harlan when the fire started. He rode south before anyone even knew which way the fire was going." She paused. "Frank Holt's barn burned. 3 other families lost fence line and a season's worth of cut hay. And Nathan Caldwell was sitting in the hotel dining room." Something moved in Ethan's expression. Careful recognition. "The commission hearing is in 10 days, he said slowly. "Corbin gets there in 8. And between now and then," Clara said, "every rancher on this slope knows who came out yesterday and who didn't." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not saying it changes the law, but it changes something." He thought about it. "You want to use it?" "I want Corbin to know about it," she said. "What he does with it is his business." Ethan looked at the children on the porch. The older one had fallen asleep against the rail boneless with the total exhaustion of the young. The younger one was watching a beetle make its way across the porch board with the focused attention of a child who had decided this was the most interesting thing in the world. "Write to Corbin today," he said. "Tell him everything that happened. The fire, who responded, who didn't. Let him build the argument." "Will you help me write it?" He looked at her. "You don't need my help to write a letter, Clara." "I know I don't need it," she said. "I'm asking if you want to help." A pause. Then something in him that was still learning how to accept things accepted that one. "Yes," he said. "I'll help." They wrote the letter at the kitchen table while Vera Holt's children napped on the front room floor. Clara wrote. Ethan sat across from her and said what he thought should go in and what should be left out, and she agreed with most of it and argued with one part, and he conceded with the plainness that she'd learned was just his way of acknowledging when someone was right. When it was done, she read it back, and it was good. It was clear and specific, and it laid out the facts without overstating them, which was exactly what a lawyer needed. She looked up and found him watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. And then after a beat, "You're good at this. At writing letters. At knowing what matters," he said. "Most people include everything when they're angry. You cut straight to the thing." She held his gaze for a moment. "I had a good teacher," she said. He looked away first. She folded the letter and sent it with the next writer. The days between the fire and the hearing moved fast and slow, at the same time the way days do when something significant is approaching and you can't decide whether you want it to arrive or not. The valley was changed by the fire. Not destroyed, the damage was real, but survivable, but changed in the way that shared disaster changes communities, shaking loose some of the calcifications that had built up over years of people minding their own business a little too carefully. Ruth Garner came by with her sister to help Clara clear the ashfall from the vegetable patch. Two men from the far side of the valley rode up to Ethan's ridge. She learned this secondhand from Frank Holt to find out what he'd done to protect his property, and he'd told them plainly about fire breaks and how to build them. Doris Hallett stopped Clara on the street in Harlan and said without preamble, "I want to apologize properly. I was small about Mr. Walker's visits, and I was wrong to be." She said it like a woman who had decided something and was following through before she lost her nerve. "You've been a better neighbor to this valley than most of us who've been here 20 years. Clara thanked her and meant it, and went on about her business. What she didn't share with any of them was what was sitting at the center of her thinking. Not the commission hearing, not the water claim, not Caldwell. Those things were real, and she was attending to them. But what sat at the center was the moment in the yard after the fire when she'd put her arms around Ethan Walker and felt him hold on. And what had and hadn't been said since. Nothing had been said since. That was the fact she was living inside. He still came down each morning. He still worked. He still sat at the kitchen table for the letters and the planning and the evenings when work stretched long. But there was a new quality to the silence between them, charged like the air before a thunderstorm, like something that both of them were aware of, and neither of them had figured out what to do with. She didn't push. She'd learned that pushing Ethan Walker was like pushing a wall, not because he was stubborn, but because he needed to arrive at things himself in his own time. Rushing him would only make him retreat, and retreat was the one thing she absolutely did not want. So she waited. And while she waited, she noticed things. She noticed that he stayed later in the evenings now. Not by much, half an hour, sometimes an hour, but later. She noticed that he'd started leaving small things, a repaired tool left on the workbench, with no comment. A new length of rope coiled on the fence post, once a bunch of dried mountain herbs tied with twine that she found on the porch step and had to look at for a long moment before she understood what they were and where they'd come from. She put the herbs in a jar on the kitchen windowsill. She didn't mention it. But he saw the jar the next morning, and he didn't say anything either, and that was a conversation of its own. James Corbin arrived on Thursday 2 days before the hearing. He came directly to the farm, not to the hotel, which told her he took the meeting seriously. He sat at the kitchen table, the table that had become the center of everything this summer. And he opened his case and he said, "The letter about the fire was important. Thank you." "Will you use it?" Ethan asked. "Strategically," Corbin said. "Not as a legal argument. Caldwell's character isn't technically relevant to the validity of the water claim. But it's relevant to the Commission's understanding of who they're dealing with." He paused. "I've spoken to 5 ranchers who are prepared to come to the hearing and sit in the room. They won't testify. They don't need to. But their presence establishes something." "What does it establish?" Clara asked. "That Miss Whitmore isn't alone," he said simply. She felt something tighten in her throat. "The core of our case is straightforward," Corbin continued. "Prior appropriation documented and filed. The 1869 letter authenticated. The planting records corroborated. I've engaged the examiner from Missoula. He can't come in person, but he's provided a written assessment of the letter's authenticity that the Commission is obligated to consider." He looked at them both. "If Caldwell wants to challenge this, he has to produce evidence of forgery. He doesn't have evidence of forgery, because there was no forgery." "Then what's his argument?" Clara asked. "That the claim was filed in bad faith. That you filed it specifically to obstruct his water proposal, rather than for legitimate agricultural purposes." He set a paper on the table. "This is his formal objection, submitted yesterday." Clara read it. Her jaw tightened. He's saying I don't actually farm this land, she said, that I have an insufficient operation to justify a water claim. Yes. Then we show the operation, Ethan said. Both Clara and Corbin looked at him. He was looking at this paper with the flat, clear expression of a man who had found the answer to something. She's been farming this land since she arrived. 8 months of planting records, irrigation records, livestock records. We have all of it. He looked at Clara. Your father's horse breeding logs, the ones you saved from the fire, they show agricultural operation going back 30 years. Continuous, documented, legitimate. He looked at Corbin. Can you use that? Corbin was already writing. I can use all of it. He looked up. Mr. Walker, you've been present on this property for much of the summer. Are you willing to give a statement attesting to the agricultural operation you've observed? A pause. Yes, Ethan said. Clara looked at him. He would have to stand up in front of the commission and the town and say plainly what he'd been doing here all summer and what the farm was and what it meant. For a man who had lived on a ridge alone for 6 years, that was not a small thing. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and she said, with her eyes, "Only are you sure?" And he said with his yes. Good, Corbin said, and kept writing. The night before the hearing, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed and listened to the house settle and thought about every decision that had led to this coming home to her father, staying after he died, filing the water claim, writing to Corbin, building the fire break. Every decision had led to the next, and now she was here, the morning side of the most important day her farm had seen, maybe ever. She got up before dawn and went to the kitchen and built a fire in the stove and put water on. She sat at the table with her coffee and her father's horseshoe, which she'd taken from the jar and set on the table after the fire, and she held it in both hands. "I'm trying, Daddy," she said quietly to the empty kitchen, to the horseshoe, to whatever remained of Thomas Whitmore in the house he'd built and the land he'd loved. "I'm trying to do it right." She heard boots on the porch. She looked up. Ethan was at the door, which was unusual. He never came this early, and his expression when she let him in told her he hadn't slept either. "You're early," she said. "Couldn't stay up there," he said. He looked at the horseshoe in her hands. She set it on the table between them. "Sit down." He sat. She poured him coffee. They sat across from each other in the pre-dawn kitchen, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him. "When I give that statement today," he said carefully, "I'm going to tell the truth. About being here, about the work we've done, about the farm." He paused. "But there are things I'm going to say that will tell the town things about me that I've been not hiding exactly. Just not offering." "Things like what?" He put both hands around his coffee cup. "When I left Wyoming, I didn't just sell the land and come north. I spent time, a year, maybe more, that I'm not proud of. I was not a careful man. I was a man with nothing to lose, and I moved through that time accordingly." He didn't look away from her. "Nothing criminal. But there are people in Helena who knew me then and know me differently than I am now." She absorbed this. "Is there anyone on the commission who'd know you from that time?" "I don't think so, but I don't know for certain. And if Caldwell's done his research, has he given any indication?" "No, but Caldwell's smart. He'll use what he can find." Clara set down her cup. "Ethan, what you did in the year after you lost your family that year belongs to the worst grief I can imagine. I don't hold it against you. No one with any decency would." He looked at her. Something in him was very still. "You didn't know that before now," he said. "No," she said. "But I know it now." She held his gaze. "Is there anything else? Anything that could actually damage the case?" He thought, really thought, with the thoroughness he gave to everything. "No," he said. "Then we go in today, and we tell the truth, and we let Corbin do his job," she said. "That's all." He looked at her across the table and across the horseshoe, and across the whole summer that had happened between two people who had both in different ways stopped expecting anything and then found themselves in possession of something they hadn't known to want. "Clara," he said. She waited. "I built something when I came up to that ridge," he said. "A house. Small. It's solid. I made sure of that, but it's small. One room, a lean-to for the horses." He was choosing his words with great care. "I built it to last because I believed in doing work right, even if it was only for myself." He paused. "But I stopped building things past that. Past what I needed for one person." She was very still. "I'm saying," he said, and she could see what this was costing him, and also that he'd decided to pay it, that I think I've been building things for one person long enough." The kitchen was very quiet. "Ethan Walker," she said. "Yes. Are you telling me you'd like to build something bigger?" He looked at her directly. "I am." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand under hers and held on. They sat like that while the light came up, the coffee going warm and then cool, the house settling around them, the east field that she'd planted and he'd helped irrigate, greening up out there in the early morning, and the horseshoe her father had hung above the door, sitting between them on the table like a witness. The commission hearing was held in the Harlan Meeting Hall, which was also used for church on Sundays and town socials in winter, and which smelled permanently of candle wax and old pine, and the particular dry warmth of a room that held many meetings. Clara arrived with Corbin on one side and Ethan on the other. There were people in the room she hadn't expected. The 5 ranchers Corbin had mentioned were there in the back 2 rows, sitting with their hats in their laps. Ruth Garner and her husband, Frank and Vera Holt, who had driven in from a farm that still smelled of smoke. Doris Hallett, sitting very straight near the middle. Miles Peabody, who gave Clara a small nod when she came in. And Nathan Caldwell at a table across the room with his own lawyer, a man from Missoula named Garrett, who wore his suit like armor and had the particular confidence of someone accustomed to winning. Commissioner Harwick called the room to order with the efficiency of a man who wanted to be done by noon. Corbin presented first. He was precise and unhurried, and the documentation he laid before the commission was organized with a clarity that Clara had come to recognize as his particular gift. He made the obvious obvious, and the complicated simple, and he did it without appearing to try. The 1869 letter, the planting records, the Missoula Examiner's written assessment, a timeline of the Whitmore family's agricultural use of the East Creek going back 30 years, presented as a single clean document that showed at a glance what 30 years of farming looked like. Then Caldwell's lawyer Garrett stood up and made his argument. It was polished and aggressive, and it came down to 2 points. The claim was filed strategically to obstruct Caldwell's water proposal, and the operation on the Whitmore farm was insufficient to justify the appropriation. Harwick looked at Corbin. Response. "I have a witness," Corbin said. Ethan Walker stood up. Clara felt something in the room change when he did. Not loud, just a shift like a weight redistributing. People knew who he was. 6 years on the ridge, never quite present, always somehow known. His standing up in this room in public for something that wasn't his land, that meant something. He gave his statement in the same way he did everything plainly, without excess, with the authority of someone reporting what he had actually seen. He described the farm, the irrigation channel and when it had been cleared, and what the east field looked like after, the vegetable patch, the horses, the fire break that had been built 3 days before the fire. The bucket line they'd run to wet the walls. He described Clara Whitmore's farm as what it was, a working agricultural operation run by a woman who understood the land and the water and the work. Garrett tried to cross-examine. "Mr. Walker, you've been present on this property frequently since early summer. Is that correct?" "Yes." "In what capacity?" "Neighbor," Ethan said. "You've performed labor on the property." "I have." "Unpaid labor?" "Yes." "Isn't it possible that your perspective on this operation is colored by your personal relationship with Miss Whitmore?" The room went very quiet. Ethan looked at Garrett with the calm of a man who had nothing to hide and knew it. My perspective on this operation is colored by having watched it from a ridge for 6 years and then close up for a summer, he said. I've watched farms fail, and I've watched them succeed. I know the difference. This operation is legitimate, well-run, and actively using the water in question for agricultural purpose. He paused. That's not my relationship talking. That's what I saw. Garrett had no follow-up. Harwick made notes. Then Caldwell's lawyer tried a different angle. He stood up and said, "The commission should be aware that the individual testifying on Miss Whitmore's behalf has a complicated personal history. His time in Wyoming and his subsequent..." Corbin was on his feet. "I object to this line entirely. Mr. Walker's personal history has no bearing on the validity of a documented water claim. What we're examining is the documentation, not the character of a witness to agricultural practice." Harwick looked at both lawyers. "Sustained," he said dryly. "Mr. Garrett, unless you have evidence directly relevant to the authenticity of the documentation, I'd ask you to stay on point." From the back of the room, Clara heard Frank Holt say quietly, but clearly enough to carry, "Man saved half this valley's farms by telling us to clear our fire breaks. That's his history as far as I'm concerned." Harwick didn't reprimand him. He made a note. Garrett had nothing else. Caldwell sat at his table with the stillness of a man swallowing something bitter, and Clara looked at him once and then looked away, because she didn't need to watch him lose. She just needed to win. Harwick conferred with his 2 fellow commissioners for 11 minutes. Clara counted. She sat with her hands flat on the table, and Corbin beside her and Ethan on the other side, and the room full of people who had come to see what happened when one woman on 14 acres decided that no was a complete sentence. Harwick cleared his throat. "The commission finds the prior appropriation claim on the East Creek of the Whitmore property to be valid and properly documented," he said. "The claim is affirmed. Mr. Caldwell's pending proposal for redirection of said water source is denied pending Miss Whitmore's written agreement, which she is under no obligation to provide." Clara closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them, and Corbin was shaking her hand, and Ethan was standing beside her, and the room was making the particular noise of people who have witnessed something definitive and are deciding what to do with it. Nathan Caldwell left without speaking to anyone. Roy was not there. Ruth Garner came forward and took Clara's hands in both of hers and said, "Your father would have been so proud." Clara felt the stone in her chest, the one that had been there since the day she dug his grave shift slightly. Not dissolve, but move. "Thank you," she said. She shook Corbin's hand. She thanked Frank Holt, who waved it off. She nodded to Doris Hallett, who nodded back with the particular dignity of a woman who has made amends and feels better for it. And then when the room had mostly cleared, she stood with Ethan near the door. He had put his hat back on. He was looking at the room, not at her, at the room, at what had just happened in it. "You knew it would go that way," she said. "I hoped," he said. "Knowing and hoping aren't the same thing." "Which were you doing?" He looked at her. "Both," he said honestly. She looked at him, this man who had come down from a ridge to help a woman with a cracked axle and hadn't quite managed to leave, and she thought about what he'd said at the kitchen table in the pre-dawn light, about building things for one person long enough. "Ethan," she said. "Yes." "When we get home," she said, "I'd like you to show me the ridge." He went still. "Your place," she said. "The house you built. I've never seen it." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face, layer after layer of it, the way stone moves in deep water, slow and significant. "All right," he said. They walked out of the Harlan meeting hall into the August afternoon, the summer pressing warm around them, and the east field was waiting at home, and the horses were in the paddock, and the water claim was affirmed and legal and permanent. And Ethan Walker, who had spent 6 years building a small house for one person, was walking beside her toward the rest of it. She did not reach for his hand. He reached for hers. She took it. They walked to the wagon, and the horseshoe was in her coat pocket, and the summer was not yet over, and ahead of them was the ridge and what was on it, and whatever came after that. She did not know all of what it would look like, But she was no longer afraid of not knowing. That she thought was a different kind of beginning. He rode ahead of her on the way up to the ridge, not because she needed leading, but because the trail narrowed in places, and his horse knew it better than hers. She followed and watched the way he moved easy in the saddle, unhurried, reading the ground through the horse, the way a man does when he's covered the same trail so many times it's become part of him. The ridge house appeared before she expected it. She had imagined something barely habitable. What she found was small but deliberate, every piece of it placed with the care of a man who had nothing else to do with his attention for 6 years and had put all of it here. The walls were solid. The roof was sound. There was a porch she hadn't expected, narrow but real, with a single chair on it facing east toward the valley. She stood in front of it and didn't say anything for a moment. "It's good work," she said finally. "I had time," he said. He was watching her look at it. She walked to the porch and touched one of the posts. It was sunk deep and set true. She turned to look at the view from where the chair sat. The whole valley laid out below her farm, visible on the slope, the east field a green rectangle against the dry summer gold of the surrounding land. "You could see everything from here," she said. "Yes." "You watched the whole valley for 6 years from this chair." "Yes." She turned to look at him. He was standing at the edge of the porch hat in his hand, watching her with an expression that was open in a way she hadn't seen on him before. Like he'd taken something down that he'd had up for a long time. "Why one chair, Ethan?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I only planned on one person." She held his gaze. "And now—" He looked at the chair, then back at her. "Now I think I need to build another one." She stepped off the porch and walked to him and stood close enough that she had to look up to see his face. "I think," she said carefully, "that before you build another chair up here, we need to talk about something." "All right." "This house," she said. "It's yours. The farm is mine. They're 8 miles apart." "I know the distance," he said. "I'm not asking you to give up the ridge," she said. "I'm not asking you to give up anything. But I want to know what you're thinking, plainly, not in hints and herbs on the porch step." She saw the corner of his mouth move. "I want to know what Ethan Walker is thinking about what comes next." He put his hat back on. He looked at the valley for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "I'm thinking," he said, "that I've been up on this ridge long enough. I'm thinking that the work I've been doing on your farm is the most useful I've felt in 6 years. I'm thinking that the kitchen table where we write letters is the best place I've been in longer than that." He paused. "And I'm thinking that you're the most honest person I've met since I lost the last one, and that I don't want to lose that to 8 miles of mountain trail." Clara looked at him. "Then come down," she said simply. "It's not that simple." "Tell me why." He was quiet for a moment. "Because if I come down, I'm not just helping a neighbor. I'm building something. And the last time I built something, I lost it so completely that there was nothing left." He looked at her directly. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I want you to understand what it costs me to stand here and say that I want to try anyway." Clara felt something in her chest pull tight and then release. "Ethan!" She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, because they were past the point of careful distances, and she was done pretending otherwise. "Listen to me. I dug my father's grave alone. I drove a cracked axle 7 miles home alone. I filed a water claim against a man with 40 years of leverage on this county, and I did it knowing it might not work." She held his gaze. "I am not fragile, and I am not going anywhere." She paused. "What happened to you in Wyoming was the worst thing I can imagine. But it did not use up all the good that's coming to you. It doesn't work that way." He put his hand over hers where it rested against his face. He held it there. "I don't know how to do this anymore," he said quietly. "I used to. I've forgotten some of it." "So have I," she said. "We'll figure it out." He turned his face slightly and pressed his lips to her palm, brief and certain, and she felt it all the way through. "All right," he said. "All right," she said back. They stood on the ridge with the whole valley below them and the summer air moving around them, and 6 years of his solitude beginning slowly and irrevocably to become something else. He didn't move down immediately. That wasn't who he was. What he did was begin the work of it, the slow, methodical transfer of a life that had been arranged for one person into something that had room for more. He came down to the farm every day, same as before, but he stayed later now, and sometimes when the work ran long, he didn't go back to the ridge until after dark. And once, during a stretch of days when a late summer storm made the trail treacherous, he slept in the barn without either of them making a particular thing of it. Clara didn't push the pace. She'd said what she had to say on the ridge, and she meant all of it. And she let him move at the speed of a man who had learned to be very careful with the things that mattered. What she did do was put a second chair on the porch. She'd made it herself over 3 evenings from the good timber she had left from the barn repair. It wasn't as fine as her father's chair, which had been built by a man with more patience for woodworking than she had. But it was solid, and it was level, and it sat on the right side of the door where the evening light came best. She didn't say anything to Ethan about it. She just put it there. The first evening he saw it, he stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then he climbed the steps and sat in it. It held. He looked at the east field and the mountain line and the way the light was moving across everything. He said, "You made this." "I did." "It's good work." "I had a good teacher," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. And then they both looked at the valley and the evening, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it. The letter came from Roy Caldwell on a Friday. Not from Nathan, from Roy, which itself was a signal of something. Clara read it at the kitchen table with Ethan beside her, and what it said was this: Nathan Caldwell had sold the South Fields to a land company out of Billings. He was retiring from active ranch management. Roy would be handling the remaining Caldwell properties going forward with considerably reduced holdings. At the bottom in Roy's handwriting was one sentence that had no legal language in it at all. It said, "I should have been a better man about this from the start. I'm sorry for the trouble we caused." Clara set the letter down. "Roy Caldwell apologized to me," she said. Ethan read the letter again. He did. "Do you believe him?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I believe he believes it right now," he said. "Whether it holds is a different question." He looked at her. "Does it matter?" She thought about it honestly. "Not to the water claim," she said. "That's permanent regardless of what Roy believes." She paused. "But maybe a little. To the valley. To what comes next." "The valley's going to be different now that Nathan's out," Ethan said. 3 families he's been squeezing for years will have room to breathe. That changes things." "Frank Holt told me his wife cried when she heard," Clara said. "Vera Holt has been holding that farm together by herself for 2 years, while Nathan made their debt impossible," Ethan said flatly. "She earned those tears." Clara folded Roy's letter and set it with the rest of the documentation. Not because it had legal significance, but because it was part of the record of this summer, and she was finding that she wanted to keep the whole record, the good of it and the hard of it together. "What do you want to do with the rest of the day?" Ethan asked. She looked at him. "The north fence needs a post replaced." "I saw that this morning." "I thought we could do it this afternoon." "All right," he said. They got up from the table together and went out to work. And the afternoon was long, and the light was good, and the post went in solid and true. And it was such an ordinary thing, 2 people fixing a fence on a Tuesday afternoon, and it was also the exact shape of what she had been building toward all summer without quite knowing it. Chache. It was Ruth Garner who first said it out loud, which was fitting, because Ruth had always been honest in ways that other people in Harlan managed to avoid. She came by on a Saturday morning in early September with preserves and her daughter. And while the daughter helped Clara in the kitchen, Ruth sat on the porch with her coffee and watched Ethan working at the barn, and when Clara came out, she said without looking away from him, "He's staying." It wasn't a question. "He's here most days." Clara said carefully. That's not what I said. Ruth looked at her. I said he's staying. There's a difference. She took a sip of her coffee. When Tom finally decided to stop being a fool about things, I knew it before he did. Men always know things last. She paused. Does he know? I think he's getting there, Clara said. Ruth nodded slowly. He's a good man. I know Frank said different before. Frank was wrong. She looked at the barn. The way he worked the bucket line during the fire. The way he talked to the commission. A man who's only passing through doesn't do those things. She looked at Clara. He's been passing through for 6 years. He's done with it. Clara looked at Ethan at the barn. He was repairing the hinge on the large door, the one she'd been putting off because it required 2 people to hold the door while the hinge was set, and she only had 1 pair of hands. He'd arrived this morning, looked at it, said, "We should do that today," and gone straight to it. Yeah, Clara said quietly. I think he is. Ruth patted her knee and finished her coffee, and that was the end of it. The twist came from a direction Clara hadn't anticipated, because the ones that matter always do. It was a Wednesday in the 2nd week of September, and she was in the field, checking the winter wheat it was coming in. Well, the height and color, both strong, when she heard a wagon on the track, and looked up to see a man she didn't recognize driving up toward the house. She walked up from the field to meet him. He was older, well-dressed in a way that wasn't local, with a leather case beside him on the wagon seat. He introduced himself as Douglas Merritt, and he was a land agent from Helena, and what he said next rearranged the landscape of the whole conversation in a way she hadn't been prepared for. Miss Whitmore, he said, I represent a railroad concern that's been surveying the Bitterroot Corridor. We've been looking at potential station sites along the eastern slope. He opened his case. Your property came up, specifically the location relative to the Valley Road and the water source. Clara stood very still. A railroad station. A supply depot, more precisely. Not on your land, we'd need land further down the slope. But the access road would run through your north corner, and we'd need water rights agreement for a depot tank. He looked at her steadily. We'd pay for the easement and negotiate the water agreement at fair market rate, ongoing per year. She heard boots behind her and knew without looking that Ethan had come up from the barn. Who have you spoken to so far? Ethan's voice came from just behind her left shoulder. Merritt looked at him. We've been down the slope. Several property owners. Some interested, some not. He paused. We've been told Miss Whitmore's water claim is the one that matters for the tank. Clara's mind was moving fast. The water claim she'd fought for all summer. The claim that had been about protecting the farm from Caldwell had just become something else entirely. The creek that Nathan Caldwell had wanted for his south fields was the same creek a railroad depot would need for a supply tank. Which meant the claim she held wasn't just defensive protection. It was leverage. Real leverage. The kind with a dollar value. How long do we have to consider? She asked. We're making determinations in the next 30 days, Merritt said. If the eastern slope route is confirmed, we'd want agreements in place before winter. You'll have an answer within 2 weeks, she said. Merritt nodded, tipped his hat, and drove back down the track. Clara stood in the yard and listened to the wagon go, and did not turn around for a long moment. Then she turned. Ethan was watching her with an expression she'd learned to read by now. The one that meant he was waiting for her to be the first one to say the thing, because he'd already thought it and wanted to know if she'd gotten there herself. The water claim, she said. Yes, he said. It's not just the farm anymore. No, he said. She looked at him. If the railroad comes through and I negotiate a water agreement, the income from that alone could retire the debt. All of it, in 2 or 3 years. Yes, he said. Ethan, why are you just saying yes? This is... She stopped, felt the size of it settle over her. This changes everything. It changes the financial picture, he said carefully. It doesn't change the farm. It doesn't change the water. It doesn't change what you built here. He paused. It just means the thing you fought for is worth more than you knew when you were fighting for it. She looked at him. Did you know? When we filed, Did you know about the railroad survey? He shook his head. No. I knew there'd been talk of a railroad corridor through the Bitterroot for years. I didn't know they were actively surveying. He met her eyes. Clara, this is yours. You filed that claim. You held it against Caldwell. You won it. Whatever it's worth is what you earned. She sat down on the porch step because her legs needed a moment. He sat beside her. I came home to keep my father's farm from dying, she said. I came home because he wrote me 4 words and I couldn't say no. She was looking at the east field. I didn't come home because I had a plan. I came home because he needed me. And then he was gone and you stayed, Ethan said. And then he was gone and I stayed, she agreed. Because by then it was mine, and I didn't know what I was yet if I wasn't someone who stays. He was quiet beside her. I know what you are, he said. She looked at him. You're the person who stays, he said, and then fights, and then figures out that the staying and the fighting made something that was worth more than you knew. He looked at the field. I've been watching this farm all summer. I've been watching you. And I want to tell you something that I should have said a long time ago. She waited. When I came down from that ridge the first time, he said, I told myself it was because the road was going the right direction, and I knew what a cracked axle sounded like. He looked at his hands. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. He looked at her. The whole truth is that I'd been watching this farm for 8 months, and I'd watched you keep it alive when I didn't think it was possible, and I came down that road because I wanted to be closer to something that was alive. He paused. I'd forgotten what that felt like. Clara looked at this man who had come down from a mountain because he wanted to be near something living, and who had spent a summer becoming something living himself. And she thought about her father's horseshoe, and the 4 words in the letter, and all the decisions that had led to this step. Ethan Walker, she said. Yes, I would like you to come down from that ridge, she said, not to help with the fence or the water or the railroad negotiation, just to come down. She held his gaze. I want you here, not as a neighbor, as here, with me, as in for good. He looked at her for a long moment. That's a big thing to say, he said. I know it is, she said. I mean it as big as it sounds. The silence between them was not empty. It was the fullest silence she'd ever sat inside. I'll need to bring some things down from the ridge, he said finally. Yes, she said, and felt something in her chest open like a door that had been stuck for a long time. You will. The chair I'll leave up there, he said. I'd like to keep it. Go up sometimes. Of course. And the property on the ridge is yours, she said. It'll always be yours. I'm not asking you to give anything up. He looked at her. You're asking me to add to it. Yes, she said. That's exactly what I'm asking. He stood up from the porch step and held out his hand. She took it and stood. All right, he said. Those 2 words from this man meant everything they were supposed to mean, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. He brought 3 things down from the ridge the following Saturday. The first was a small wooden box that had belonged to his wife. He didn't explain it, and she didn't ask, just accepted it with the care it deserved and put it on the mantel where it could be seen. The second was a blanket his mother had made heavy wool in dark reds and browns, which he draped over the back of his new chair on the porch, like it had always lived there. The third thing he brought down was a photograph. Small in a tin frame, slightly faded. A woman with dark hair and a direct gaze, and beside her a small boy of maybe 3, squinting against the sun. He set it on the kitchen windowsill, next to the jar that still held the dried mountain herbs from early summer. Clara looked at it. Sarah, he said quietly, and James. They're beautiful, she said, and meant it without reservation, without complexity, the way you mean something when you understand its full weight. I kept them put away for a long time, he said. I thought looking at them was the same as losing them all over again. He looked at the photograph. But I think I was wrong. I think keeping them put away was its own kind of loss. He paused. I'd like them to be here, in this room, if that's all right. It's all right, she said. It's more than all right. He nodded once, and she saw the way the set of his shoulders changed when she said it, some tension releasing that he'd been carrying without knowing he still had it. She put her hand briefly on his arm, and then went back to what she'd been doing, because some moments need to be allowed to settle without a lot of attention on them. October came in cold and clean, the way October does in the mountains, when summer has finally decided it's done. The winter wheat was in and strong. The water claim was permanent and documented and filed in triplicate with the county seat. James Corbin had sent a letter confirming that Nathan Caldwell's withdrawal from active ranching made any future challenge to the claim functionally impossible. He had no standing left to bring one. Douglas Merritt's Railroad Company had sent a formal letter of intent regarding the easement and water agreement. Clara had read it with Ethan and Corbin both, and the terms were fair, and she'd signed it on a Thursday morning with her father's pen, which she'd found in the tobacco tin. The debt would be gone in 18 months. 18 months. She'd done the numbers 3 times because she didn't trust the first 2. On a Saturday morning in mid-October, Frank and Vera Holt came by with their family, and the Garners came, and Miles Peabody came, and Doris Hallett came with a pie. And somehow, without anyone formally organizing it, there were a dozen people in and around the farmhouse, and the barn, and the porch. And it felt like the kind of thing that happens when a community remembers it's a community. Frank Holt stood with Ethan at the fence line for a long time, and Clara watched from the porch and couldn't hear what they said, but she saw Frank put his hand on Ethan's shoulder, and she saw the way Ethan received it, not stiffly, not deflecting, just present. Ruth Garner came and stood beside Clara on the porch. "You know what this place needed," Ruth said. "Tell me," Clara said. "People in it," Ruth said simply. "Your daddy was a good man, but he kept to himself more than was healthy. A farm needs people moving through it." She looked at the yard full of neighbors. "This is what it looks like when a place is properly alive." Clara looked at it too. At Vera Holt's kids running between the barn and the fence. At Miles Peabody talking to Doris Hallett with an animation she'd never seen from him in the store. At Ethan at the fence with Frank, 2 quiet men in the middle of all of it standing easy. "Yeah," Clara said softly. "It is." That evening, after everyone had gone, Clara and Ethan sat on the porch in their 2 chairs. The valley was going dark below them, and the stars were coming out the way they do in October, sharper than summer, more deliberate, like the sky had stopped being lazy about it. They'd been quiet for a while, the good kind of quiet, the kind that's full rather than empty. Then Ethan said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him. "When Roy Caldwell came to my ridge back in the summer, he said, and told me I was wasting my time coming down here, he said something else. Something I didn't repeat to you." She waited. "He said no woman who'd let a stranger fix her fences was worth respecting." He said it flatly, without heat. "That what you were letting me do was charity, and that a woman who needed charity couldn't hold a farm." Clara looked at him steadily. "And what did you think when he said that? I thought he was a man who'd never needed anything in his life and mistook that for virtue." He looked at the valley. "And I thought he was wrong about charity. What you let me do wasn't charity. It was you were letting me back into something, into the business of caring about what happens, into—" He stopped. "Into living," she said quietly. "Into living." He agreed. They sat with that for a moment. "Ethan," she said. "Yes, you walked me home the very first night, down that road with the cracked axle. You road cleared 7 miles so I'd get home safe." She turned to look at him. "And then you kept coming back." "I did." "Why did you keep coming back honestly, before the fence and the channel and all of it? That first week before you knew any of this would matter. Why did you keep coming back?" He was quiet for a long moment, the longest pause she'd heard from him in weeks, which meant he was being very careful with the answer. "Because," he said finally, "coming back felt like something a person does. Not a man living alone on a ridge. A person. He looked at her. I'd been a man on a ridge for 6 years. I wanted to be a person again. Clara looked at him, this scarred, careful, quietly extraordinary man, and felt the full weight of the summer settle into something permanent. Not the legal permanence of a water claim or a railroad easement. The other kind. The kind that lives in a person and doesn't leave. You keep walking me home, she said, and her voice was lighter than she'd intended, the way it sometimes went when something was too large for a serious tone to carry. Every time. One way or another. He looked at her, and for the first time in all the months she'd known him, the almost smile became an actual one. It changed his whole face. It was the best thing she'd seen all year, maybe longer. Maybe, he said, I like the company. She reached over and took his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair she'd built. He held on the same way he always did, carefully, certainly like something he intended to keep. The stars came out the rest of the way, and the valley went dark, and the 2 chairs on the porch held what they were built to hold, and the horseshoe above the door kept doing what it had always done. And on 14 acres on the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Range in the summer of 1883, that turned into the autumn that turned into everything. After a woman who knew how to stay, and a man who had finally remembered how to come home, found out that those 2 things put together made something neither of them could have built alone. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was more than enough.